Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. On this episode, we're talking about the idea of negotiating a truce with Russia, a peace in our time, or possibly a steaming pot of trouble seasoned with a dash of false hope. The debate rages on. Is a quick agreement the express lane to lasting tranquility, or a sneaky way to end up with a Trojan horse in your front yard? Now, it's no secret that many people are desperate for an end to the war. And you can't blame them. Constant fear of aggression, skyrocketing prices, and countless deaths. Negotiating a truce might sound like a sweet lullaby to help us all sleep better at night, but those so-called peace proposals come with some potentially massive strings attached, and we might not like what they are attached to. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Russia is not ready to lay down its arms and pick up a set of pens to sign a peace deal. The Kremlin seems to reject a key tenet of Donald Trump's would-be peace plan that he intends to force through once he is in office. This comes as Russian forces have made significant gains in the war in Ukraine. November of 2024 was the worst month for Kiev in terms of territory lost since 2022. Vladimir Putin had publicly rejected the notion that Russia would accept a deferring of Ukraine's NATO membership in exchange for a ceasefire.
From the point of view of historical distances and dates, so to speak, this is just an instant. What difference does it make to us today, tomorrow, or in 10 years? At the tail end of 2024, there were many reports and forecasts that the war in Ukraine would come to an end in the following year. Even among Ukrainian soldiers, there have been signs suggesting that some people simply have had enough of the fighting. But whether either side will actually sit at the negotiating table seems to depend on US pressure.
We'll be talking to President Putin, and we'll be talking to the representatives, Zelensky and representatives from Ukraine. We got to stop it.
Trump's peace plan for Ukraine has been the subject of widespread speculation as the US president-elect is keeping his cards close to his chest. Even Vladimir Putin says he doesn't know the details. What we do know, however, is that Trump has chosen retired General Keith Kellogg as his special envoy for the war. Kellogg had co-authored a strategy paper which suggested that the US would continue to arm Kiev on the condition that it takes part in peace talks. This document also suggested that NATO could put Ukraine's membership on hold and there could be some relief when it comes to sanctions on Russia, in exchange, of course, for joining the negotiating table. It isn't exactly clear whether these terms would be acceptable to Ukraine itself. Kiev has said time and again that it wants concrete security guarantees, such as those which would come with a NATO membership, and that it would not cede territory.
And now, as always, it's time to take a look at the issue in greater detail. So, let's begin. What are we looking at here, you may ask? Well, in the broadest possible sense, you've got a growing choir of voices saying, look, can we not all just get along? Handshakes, hugs, we'll bring the brownies. Let's do this. However, the problem is that any truce with Russia, at least as it currently stands, is essentially like telling a fox, sure, you can guard the henhouse, just promise you won't get hungry. Historically, that's not great, and by historically, I mean every time you have an untrustworthy partner with an appetite for territory, you risk the kind of heartbreak that can only be expressed by a sad violin soundtrack. Now, don't get me wrong. Peace is obviously better than war. The problem is that these negotiations often allow aggressors to keep the territory they have taken. A ceasefire might temporarily stop the bombs from falling from the skies, but it can also leave the losing side feeling both safer and, ironically, perpetually paranoid. Because if Russia gets to call the shots, we might find ourselves with a shaky peace that's enforced only by the threat of more aggression should anyone step out of line. Think about the psychology here for a moment. Even if we sign a ceasefire, the big question remains, will the newly demarcated borders be recognized by international law, or are they recognized in the same way that we recognize an X at a party? Once territory changes hands under a threat of force, it sets a pretty dangerous precedent. It signals that aggression works, and the next time someone wants a seat at the table, they will bring the entire dining set, plus a tank brigade along with them. That's not exactly the kind of housewarming party any of us wants to attend. Of course, the complexities pile up like advertising brochures. For one, both sides of the conflict have their own narratives, interests, and those all-important red lines they insist on never crossing, though Russia seems to have a habit of redesigning the map with a bright red pen whenever it sees fit. A negotiated settlement might look splendid on a whiteboard in some fancy conference room, but on the ground, it can translate to a frozen conflict scenario. The tension remains. The potential for flare-ups never truly disappears. It is the equivalent of having a fuse that's always lit, only we can't see how long it is. So, to all of you there who are bored of the nightly news, sick of the gloom and doom, and just want to see a sliver of hope, peace is wonderful, but only if it's real and not a PR stunt. It is messy, it is complicated, and it might just be the world's most stressful game of trustful. Let's just hope we don't crash onto the floor. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Joshua Bergen, NSL Program Coordinator at the Warsaw Security Forum. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you for having me.
So would you say that Russia really is prepared to negotiate in good faith? I mean, the recent pronouncements from the Russian authorities suggest not only don't they really care that much about postponing Ukraine's membership of NATO by 10, 15 or perhaps even 20 years, but also they don't really care about the idea of European peacekeepers. So what kind of peace would Russia be willing to negotiate, do you think?
Well, we've watched Russia for some time, and I don't think they have any legitimate plans to negotiate. It's fascinating to watch. I mean, many people predicted doom and gloom with Trump, but clearly his team understands Russia and understands Russia well, and Russia's playing to form.
And would you say that perhaps at this stage we're actually facing a situation whereby Russia might be bluffing because essentially some people suggest it would not be able to sustain this war effort for much longer due to economic constraints? So would you predict that after a period of harsh words there will come a time when Russia will sit down and say, okay, we accept your conditions, perhaps not immediately so, but after a while?
Well, certainly the economic conditions in Russia have deteriorated dramatically in the past 2 months. International sanctions have brought on pressure. Internal pressures have continued to grow. And while, yes, I believe there's certainly there's always going to be gamesmanship on the part of Russia. And frankly, I don't think they're ever going to negotiate in good faith when it comes to peace with Ukraine. They've consistently attacked and then sued for peace and then gone ahead to attack again. I think we'll see this also. But I also don't think the Trump team is nearly as naive as some have said. Over the past year, I've defended repeatedly the notion that Trump and company will not just hand Ukraine over to Russia. I've never believed this. And so as we're looking at it, I think, frankly, we may come to an illustration a bit like Aesop's fable, where the scorpion hitches a ride on the back of the frog, only to sting the frog in the middle of the river. And the frog replies and says, "But you stung me, and we're both going to die." And the scorpion says, "But it was in my nature." I think Russia is going to play the game that it normally plays. It's going to disrespect, it's going to cajole, it's going to continue its gray conflicts around the world. And I suspect it may well push Trump and company over the edge. Trump recently appeared in France in a blue suit and yellow tie, an obvious signal. And the folks he's appointed to his administration thus far, though yet to fully be confirmed, are by no means dovish on Russia, but in fact, most of them are hawks. So it's a fascinating play, and I think Russia may well outfox itself.
And what pressure points do you think could be applied in order to bring Russia to the negotiating table, as reluctant as it may be to actually sit down and talk?
Well, there's certainly been some talk in the lead up to a Trump administration of escalation to de-escalate. The notion that the U.S., despite claims to the contrary, would, under a Trump administration, assist Ukraine to escalate its military conflicts with expectation that that would bring Russia to the table. I think there's a greater likelihood of that than not. I think a lot has to do with how Russia plays this current moment. And frankly, I don't expect that Russia's going to play it well. It's going to overplay its hand. It's going to be dismissive, arrogant, and probably continue its sabotage and other efforts in a way that provoke the Western world, including the Trump administration, to respond as forcefully as required.
And apart from weapon deliveries, do you think that economic pressure could also play a major role? There were signals that, for example, the Russian energy sector could be hit by sanctions, which would be way more substantial than the ones that we've already seen. And this, again, could result in the Russian war economy suffering substantially from that.
Sanctions on the Russian energy sector, even Ukraine's effort to close down any remaining pathways for Russian energy out through Ukraine into Europe. I think each of these tools, points of leverage, put increasing pressure on Russia. These are all things that, frankly, I believe should have happened a while ago. The fact that they're only happening now is a bit, I think we've been a little late to the game in certain cases, meaning the entirety of the Western world. But nevertheless, as these pressures continue to unfold, and as Russia's interest rates are through the roof, as Russia's inflation is through the roof, all of these pressures are beginning to come home. And certainly we're seeing the Russian public under more pressure than ever in the past months. All those factors are weighing heavily on the Kremlin.
So now, if we assume that indeed the Trump administration is going to push for a just peace for Ukraine, or at least is going to react in an adequate way to the current attitude that Russia presents, which is one of not really, expressing any willingness to negotiate at all, at least not in good faith. It's still a long way towards attaining an actual ceasefire. So do you believe that, for example, the problem might be that even though more weapons will be delivered to Ukraine, possibly in greater quantities and with a greater efficiency than under the Biden administration, Ukraine could still have, for example, manpower problems, which have emerged earlier during the war, making it impossible to regain territories, which would have been the preferable option, naturally, from the Ukrainian standpoint and, from the European standpoint as well. But do you still think that this is achievable here in 2025, as opposed to, say, 2023, where opportunities for that were more plentiful, arguably?
Well, there's long been a skepticism of the incoming administration, and I, for one, have long looked on in frustration at the previous administration's inability to sort of get with the fact that we're actually in a conflict. The notion that it consistently tied Ukraine's hands, the notion that it consistently under-delivered equipment and permissions in the time frame necessary to actually defeat the Russians, as if somehow it's just this long stalemate. To your point, Ukraine certainly does have a manpower problem. It is a society and an economy that's significantly smaller than Russia and what Russia can throw at this. But nevertheless, I do think that in a forward-facing efforts to unseat Russia and its conflict with Ukraine, the notion of not constraining the hands as much. I mean, if we look at Russia's allies, North Korea has sent troops. China has given it almost no restrictions, save the use of nuclear. The idea that the West has consistently sort of slow-walked, I think this may well be the moment in which the West says, okay, gloves are off. This is going to come to a heel. It's going to come to heel quickly. And, its systems, equipment, and less restrictions on how to use those things may well lead to an outcome that's more favorable to everybody right now.
So what about securing Ukraine's future? If NATO membership might be off the cards, at least for now, which is, again, suboptimal, but it might be one of the conditions of a ceasefire, how do we secure Ukraine's safety and prosperity for the years and decades to come? Do you think the idea of placing peacekeepers from European countries is going to be feasible and, more importantly, is going to work in the long term?
These are both good questions. If we look at this question in totality, the notion of Ukraine, a recovering Ukraine, is absolutely impossible without peace guarantees. The notion that any Western investor, the notion that any investor is going to put hard-earned capital, blood, sweat, tears, etc., into rebuilding Ukraine is a fantasy if just across the spectrum of the event horizon, Russia can go back and batter all these things down as it has done over the past months and years in Ukraine today. The idea of NATO membership, I think, is probably the ideal solution. If politically that's untenable, then how effective is the idea of European peacekeepers? How long can this last? How much money will this cost? Because again, if those that are going to invest in Ukraine's future, rebuilding, bringing funding for bonds, funding to governments, etc., to rebuild Ukraine, don't have some modicum of assurances that Russia can't just suddenly change its mind and come in and batter these things down, I think it's a non-starter. It's not going to yield any positive effect in the long term and will only create societal chaos within Ukraine, leading to more conflict in the future, whether internal civil war or more conflict with Russia. It remains to be seen, but it will not lead to good outcomes. For Ukraine's future, it must have peace assurances, and trusting Russia is a fool's errand. Clearly, the treaties and the agreements from the late 90s were not effective, and clearly the more recent agreements to protect Ukraine and to not invade Ukraine have also fallen for naught. There's no ability to trust Russia in these cases. The Western world must recognize this, and if there's any commitment whatsoever towards rebuilding Ukraine, it must be done so in a way to where there's security assurances to those investing in that society, those investing in that economy, whether Ukrainians themselves or otherwise, have assurances that those investments will be protected in the long term.
And I assume these assurances would need to be much more ironclad than the ones in the Budapest Memorandum. I mean, if you tell Ukrainians about security assurances from foreign nations, it is understandable. They will point towards that thing, the Budapest Memorandum, and say, well, that didn't work. How can we expect anything like that to work in the future? Do you think this is actually something that could result in Ukraine choosing another path, namely nuclear rearmament at some point?
Well, there's no question the Budapest Memorandum failed. Not only did it fail from the standpoint of some of those who agreed to support security from the external side on the Western front, but it failed in the sense that Russia completely violated it. I don't think this has come up enough in the overall dialogue that Russia completely ignored this agreement, ignored this treaty, and moved forward into, it wasn't a treaty, but this agreement, and moved forward into full-on conflict with Ukraine. Would Ukraine, of course, want to rearm in a nuclear way? Of course it would. But I suspect, if we're honest, perhaps Polish leadership would as well. I think this is a bit of a non-starter at the moment under non-proliferation. But nevertheless, I can see where a state such as Ukraine's or any other state rationally that's adjacent to Russia would want to have the ability to ensure that it can defend itself without having to wait a long time for its allies and partners to show up in the context of a war or conflict.
Joshua Bergen was our guest today here on Eastern Express. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thanks for having me, as always.
And now moving on to Eastern Newsflash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Slovakia has threatened to cut aid to Ukrainian refugees over Kiev terminating the transit of Russian gas through its territory. Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico has emphasized that his country will lose hundreds of millions annually in transit revenue due to the decision made by the Ukrainians.
Robert Fico seems to be heading for a confrontation with Kiev. In addition to many of his controversial stances that are perceived as pro-Russian and borderline anti-Ukrainian, his latest threat to cut support for Ukrainian refugees has sparked outrage. This comes in the wake of his earlier warnings that Bratislava would cut power exports to Ukraine while the country is struggling with severe blackouts caused by Russia targeting its energy grid. Fico has confirmed that Slovakian, Ukrainian and European Commission representatives will convene to discuss the shutdown. Although the EU as a whole has been moving away from reliance on Russian gas, there are still countries such as Slovakia which are heavily reliant on it. This is because of the various long-term contracts they had signed with Russia's energy giant Gazprom. A switch to alternative supply routes of gas could cost Slovakia up to €220 million per year.
According to a survey conducted for Deutsche Welle, the majority of Germans support the idea of sending peacekeepers to Ukraine in the case of a ceasefire. The catch is that they are not too keen on the idea of German soldiers being sent.
Out of the almost 2,200 respondents, 54% said that they were in favour of deploying peacekeepers to Ukraine as part of a ceasefire. Only 19% were against the idea, while a quarter were undecided. In the case of the peacekeepers being German soldiers, however, the sentiment wasn't as clear. Only 23% wanted Germany to put boots on the ground in Ukraine, and a third of the respondents were against the idea entirely. The deployment of peacekeepers to Ukraine is rumoured to be part of the peace plan for the war being floated by US President-elect Donald Trump. The point of a peacekeeping force would be to ensure that Russia does not carry out another military push into Ukraine in the wake of a ceasefire.
Oil from the spill, caused by damage to 2 Russian tankers in the Black Sea, has spread to the beaches of illegally annexed Crimea. Volunteers have been intensifying their efforts to clean up the area amid what is seen as an environmental disaster.
Russian authorities say they have already removed close to 73,000 tons of oil-contaminated sand from beaches along Russia's coast. The total amount of polluted sand and soil currently stands at around 200,000 tons. The 2 Russian tankers in question were struck by a storm while in the Kerch Strait, causing severe damage to vessels which were carrying over 9,000 tons of heavy fuel oil. Around 40% of their cargo is estimated to have spilled into the sea. The cleanup process involves volunteers in protective suits manually scooping up the oil-polluted sand. Although Russian leadership has been saying the process has been going well, environmentalists and scientists alike have been criticizing the operation. They have called both its methods and equipment inadequate.
Kazakhstan has been caught in the crossfire between Russia and Azerbaijan over the crash of an Azerbaijani plane bound to Grozny, Chechnya, from Baku in December. Since the airliner had crashed near the Kazakh city of Aktau, Kazakhstan is in charge of the investigation.
Kazakh authorities have very little to gain and a lot to lose as they have to oversee the investigation of the crash. Relations between 2 of its neighbours, one small and one massive, have collapsed in the wake of the incident. Azerbaijan is keenly awaiting the investigation's results, which Kazakhstan says will come in late January. The tensions stem from Moscow refusing to admit that Russian air defences had accidentally brought the plane down, killing 38 out of its 67 passengers. Azerbaijani President Aliyev has accused the Kremlin of trying to cover up its responsibility for the disaster. He pointed out that Russian officials had offered many to quote absurd theories before evidence of a shoot-down had come to light. Testimonies from some of the surviving passengers also point to the plane having been shot down.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.